Hello to all, welcome and thank you for joining this webinar, which we've entitled Energy Efficiency and the Cooling Imperative, Tapping the Synergies with the HFC Refrigerant Phasedown under the Kigali Amendment. My name is Jenny Calder. I am the Energy Efficiency Expert for the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF, and it is my pleasure to be your moderator for today's webinar. This webinar is hosted by the WWF, the Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency, and Topten. To give you a bit of context and some opening remarks for this webinar, we decided to hold this webinar because the cooling sector is already and will increasingly become a key sector in which to target action to achieve climate and sustainable development goals. As you may know, hydrofluorocarbon, or HFCs, are commonly used as refrigerants, but have a far greater global warming potential than carbon dioxide. So much so, in fact, that some research projects have identified better refrigerant management as the #1 solution to combating climate change. In addition, the International Energy Agency estimates that energy demand from space cooling is likely to triple by 2050 without countermeasures. So improving the energy efficiency of cooling appliances is key to ensure that this increase in energy demand does not translate into an equivalent increase in greenhouse gas emissions. This global recognition of the importance of the cooling sector is certainly one of the factors that led the global community to agree on the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol in 2016 in an effort to reduce the global warming impacts of cooling equipment. The amendment comes into force in January 2019, so this is a very topical issue. With this webinar, we hope to highlight the importance of focusing on the cooling sector to reach climate and sustainable development goals. We also aim to provide an overview of the Kigali Amendment, highlighting the importance of integrating energy efficiency within its scope, and we'll also explore how to speed up its ratification and implementation. In order to do so, the webinar is organized around 3 key moments. Firstly, we will have 3 introductory presentations, followed by a 10-minute Q&A from the audience. In that respect, I would like to invite you to send us your questions in the question box during the presentations, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible within the time allocated. Please do not forget to mention at the start of your question the name of the panelist that the question is for. And then finally, we will close the webinar with a 25-minute panel discussion, exploring what more can be done to speed up the ratification and the implementation of the Kigali Amendment. I'm pleased to be joined today by 5 key experts. We have with us Dr. Xianli Zhu, who is a senior economist at the Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency. She is involved with the preparation of the report of the UN Environment's Scientific Assessment on Climate-Friendly and Efficient Cooling, which will be launched in 2019 and which will explore how to speed up the ratification and implementation of the Kigali Amendment. We also have with us today Hélène Rochat, who is an energy efficiency project manager at Topten, and who is also a member of the Energy Efficiency Task Force that investigates the challenges and opportunities for energy efficiency in the context of the Kigali Amendment. We also have with us Dan Hamza-Goodacre, who is the Executive Director of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program and who has over 20 years' experience working on climate and sustainable development. For the panel discussion at the end of this webinar, we will have participation from 2 additional experts, Tim Grabiel, an environmental lawyer at the Environmental Investigation Agency and a long-standing expert of the Montreal Protocol, as well as Paul Kellett, the Program Manager of United for Efficiency, which is a program run under the auspices of UN Environment. So I hope these introductory remarks have aroused your appetite to launch into this webinar. Please note that it is being recorded and will be available at the following link. So without further ado, I would like to hand the floor to Xianli Zhu from the Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency to present on the importance and challenges associated to access to cooling. Xianli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for the introduction. Yeah, I will briefly talk about the importance and challenges for access to cooling. this year is another record high warming year. Part of this year, for the first time, the Arctic Circle is seeing temperature above 30 degrees in the late July. And in Denmark, where it's normal, where we are based, and normally it's a very comfortable summer without a need for air conditioners, we see in May, June, and July, the temperature is more than 3 degrees above average. So it's many hot days. You can see people swimming in the sea. It's a lot more warmer than normal. So that means that not only the average temperature globally is increasing, also the area, the regions which are normally cold, is now seeing like it's a lot of longer and hotter summer period, and that means like air conditioning, cooling, the demand for air conditioning could be even increased to or expand to air regions that never think that people never imagine that they will need an air conditioner or cooling in summer. This globally, there's still a lack of access to cooling services. In developing countries, more than 50% of the food they are harvested but never reach the final consumers because they are due to the lack of refrigeration during the distribution process. They are, on the one hand, we are using, people are cutting down trees to plant crops to have more food. On the other side, a lot of food never they are produced and in dump sites or landfills. And meanwhile, we have more than 800 million people. They are suffering malnutrition because lack of food and hunger. And there's also a lot of people living in extreme poverty. And for many of these people, they live in, they're working for the agriculture sector. So therefore, that's a large lack of access to the cold chains, the refrigeration. That means their produce they can never get the income from their produce. And also this cost, lack of cooling, cost lives. Globally, 600 million people, they are ill, got ill because eating this food that's actually not suitable for eating due to this. They are already start to rotten. And also there's vaccines. People die from lack of vaccine, and the vaccine gets unusable due to lack of refrigeration. And also heat waves. People die from this hot when they are exposing to extreme hot heat. So all this make it a access to cooling very critical part for the future. The realization of the global sustainable development goals. One part is the cold chain. The cold chain means when the food is harvested, they need to be kept refrigerated, kept at a low temperature during the transport, during the distribution and the selling process. For example, for fish, if they are not, they can be, if it's kept at 30 degrees, they can be only be eatable for a few hours. But if they are kept at 0 Celsius temperature, they can be kept fresh for up to 10 days. That's why this in the developed world, a large part of the food loss is low because it's available for cold chain. But this is kind of service is not available for a large part of the developing world. That's why a large chunk of the food is lost during the distribution process. And the access to cooling is very important for the realization of multiple sustainable development goals, including reducing poverty. Because this cold chain, importance of the cold chain to the agricultural produce, so like that it's a key component to increase the income of fishermen and farmers. And it's also needed for create many jobs. That also means more income for the poor people. And also this hunger problem. Globally, that's more than 1.3 billion tons of food is lost or wasted each year. And meanwhile, the people are suffering hunger because of they cannot access the food. Another part is also cooling access and also key to the realization of good health. As I mentioned earlier, this medicine and vaccine that needed to be kept in refrigerated during the transport and storage, and also it can reduce food waste and food poisoning, and also help people make the children able to learn more and increase their productivity and ability to concentrate during their class and lessons. And also quality education. This kind of high temperature makes people feel get ill. This education with this access to cooling, air-conditioned rooms can help the children learn more and more efficiently. And this gender equity problem in many parts of the world, women, the agriculture sector, a lot of women work in the agriculture sector. So this cold chain availability can increase their income, the women's income, and narrow the gender gap. And also this decent work and economic growth. Because this cold chain and air conditioning, they can reduce waste and increase income and also make people more productive and reduce the work hours lost due to this extreme heat or people get ill due to the hot temperature. And similarly, that's also other SDGs, like SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. That's also an area like in cities, that's especially the slums, the people lack also the heat island effect. That's also temperature is higher than the surrounding rural areas. That's why that's cooling access is also very important for people living in the cities, and also responsible consumption and production. And food vaccine losses, they can be reduced through this access to refrigeration and cold chain. And also life below water, the SDG 14, because if we can capture the seafood catching stored at a refrigerator situation, then we do not need to get so many food, so much fish out of the sea. And also similarly, life on the land. If we can reduce the food wastage, then we do not need even so much arable land to be used, and not so much food end up in a dump site or landfills. Another area is when there's lack food, lack basic access for survival, this kind of for conflict and wars. So that's rising this food price, can make food more readily available and sufficient. That's also very important for peace and justice. Globally, that's unfortunately for the 2.3 billion people who are living in very hot climate zones due to lack of electricity, due to lack of access, low affordability. So that's a lot of people, and only 80% of the people have access to air conditioning. So a lot of people just suffering and do not have air conditioning. And globally, the air conditioning sales are increasing. It's in 2016 sales is more than 3 times the level in 1990. But in most regions, the air conditioner sales are increasing, but mainly it's in rich countries and in a few emerging economies. And space cooling is a problem. It's also caused peak load of grid. In some cases, it can be 75% of the peak load is from this space cooling on hot summer days. And also refrigerators is another interesting area for. It's also important. It's also because for refrigerators, they are operating 24 hours a day, all time they are all operating, and this. But in most developed countries, people have it. It's a standard appliance. It's every family have it. But in developing countries, it's still low, and the efficiency and it's or the economic impacts is high also because the refrigerator, their contribution, important contributor to the electricity bills, especially because they run all the time. And in different regions, actually the cooling demand is different. For many countries like in Europe, it's not so hot. It's more like it's for air conditioning, it's for comfortable rooms. And in some hot countries, like in the Gulf countries, it can be the cooling, the challenge is that they can use up to 70% of electricity. And in the US alone, the electricity used for air conditioning is even higher than those used all the electricity used in Africa. So this cooling, due to the population growth, rapid change in demographics, families are become smaller, and also continue urbanization and global warming. The global demand for cooling will increase. And as Jennifer has mentioned, IEA projects that if nothing happens, the global cooling demand for cooling appliances, the stock of cooling appliances by 2050 will be more than 2.5 times today's level. And the WHO is projecting that by 2050, the people died heat waves will reach 260,000. And that if climate, so this will cause a more increase in cooling demand for cooling. And at the same time, this cooling demand, increasing demand for cooling services is posing great challenge for the SDG 7 and sustainable and affordable energy access for all, and also this SDG 13 on climate change. You can see if we want to control if we keep this current technology and the growth of cooling appliances, then it will be a big challenge to keep the 2-degree target, reach the 2-degree target, and the Paris Agreement. That is because globally, even today, around 2/3 of the electricity generation is from fossil fuel. That is coal, natural gas, and oil. In fact, around 40% of the electricity generation is from coal. That's why, this increased use of cooling appliances, refrigerators, air conditioners will lead to a high increase in greenhouse gases and also energy demand. So also currently the NDCs means the global warming will be exceed 2 degrees. So that means we will need even more cooling to get people to meet the basic needs for a decent life. People need to air conditioning and need refrigerator. So in conclusion, cooling for all is very critical synergy for the realization of multiple SDGs like poverty reduction, health improvement, and even environmental protection. But at the same time, increasing access to air conditioning, refrigeration, and cold chain will cause high energy demand, especially electricity, and also the peak demand. This will make it very hard to realize the SDGs on sustainable and affordable clean energy, SDG 7 on energy and SDG 13 on climate change mitigation. So that's why it's very imperative to increase cooling access, make cooling access more accessible to more people. At the same time, we need to make the cooling clean, to make it to avoid the climate and energy problems caused by access to cooling. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Xianli. I think that was a great illustration of the challenge that lies ahead of us with regards to the cooling sector. Now I'd like to give the floor to Hélène Rochat, Energy Efficiency Project Manager at Topten, to provide her insights on the Kigali Amendment. Hélène, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Jenny. So I'm going to dive down a bit more in the details of the Kigali Amendment to see exactly what are the challenges, the technical aspects of the amendment. So the Kigali Amendment was adopted in October 2016 by all members of the Montreal Protocol. And in this amendment, we added HFCs to the list of CFCs and HCFC substances. So HFCs, which are mainly used as refrigerants for appliances such as refrigerators, air conditioners, heat pumps, have been included to this list. During the phase down of CFCs and HFCs, many of these gases have been replaced with HFCs. So that means that there are a lot of these gases out there because they were considered to be the solution for the previous phase down of the two other categories of gases. And so with the phase down of the gases, well, we expect 85% will be cut down before 2050. And there is a difference when we're talking about the phase down in between developed countries and non-developing countries. So these are the non-A5 and A5 countries, and there's differences in the schedule of the phase down. So the A5 countries, the developing countries, have more time to phase down. But then after around 2050, all countries are around the same level. And so with the Kigali Amendment, this is the first time where we've seen the words energy efficiency appear in the discussion. Because this is taken since we're going to be retrofitting a lot of new appliances, designing new technologies. It's really considered a pity not to consider energy efficiency when we are doing all these changes. So not to only take the refrigerant switch as in isolation, but include it with other aspects so we can have the biggest benefit. So here, this is a bit of an overview of what we are talking about. So these gases and categories can be very confusing. But so the main difference in between the HFCs and CFCs and HCFCs is that they do not have any ozone depleting factors. So they do not harm the ozone layer, which is the reason that the Montreal Protocol was set up to start with. But they do have high global warming potentials. If we compare them with the global warming potentials of the other gases, they're lesser, they're not as strong, but they still do have high global warming potentials compared to the natural refrigerants that are here below and that have much less of an impact. So in case the global warming potential is how much CO2 equivalent 1 kilo of this gas represents in CO2. So it can be quite substantial. And so when we're looking at HCFCs, it's also interesting to see what market we're touching, what are we looking at. And HCFCs mainly, I mean, for 86%, it's for markets that use refrigeration, air conditioning, and heat pumps. So basically, the large majority of these gases are used in this sector, and we can expect, as Xianli mentioned in her presentation, with the growth of the demand for cooling, always more and more warm countries, also demanding to have appropriate cooling, this share of refrigeration, air conditioning, and heat pumps is going to get larger and larger. So when we talk about low GWP refrigerants, there are some technical considerations that we have to look at, because in the discussions within the Montreal Protocol, these topics come up all the time, and so this actually hinders the implementation of the Kigali Amendment. So one thing is that for natural refrigerants, in some cases, some of them are flammable. So I don't know if you saw on the list above, but we had propane, for example, as one refrigerant. So this requires more skills when dealing with the refrigerant, when doing the maintenance work and installation. And this also brings a problem for high ambient temperature conditions, because in order to be able to cool a room more, because the temperature outside is higher, you need to have more refrigerant. You need to have a higher load, which means that you have more flammable refrigerant in one room, and so this can represent a safety issue. And then also this was a discussion, and this is also why energy efficiency was included in the decision from the Kigali Amendment, is that the a new refrigerant should not negatively impact the energy efficiency of the appliance. So we will see this later, but when we look at the impact of an appliance, you have to take into account the impact of the refrigerant and the impact of the other emissions that are generated through the use of that refrigerant. So in the report that was published from the Energy Efficiency Task Force this year, the task force was a group that was made to investigate this aspect for the members of the Montreal Protocol. We saw that the refrigerant choice impacts the energy efficiency only from 5 to 10%. So this is considered to be insignificant when looking at the big picture. And so this is what I was mentioning with the energy efficiency consideration, is that you always have to look at two elements. So there's the direct impact from the refrigerant when the refrigerant leaks. So this comes when maybe the appliance is poorly maintained, when it's being disassembled or incorrectly disposed of. When we see refrigerators sitting in a junkyard, well, the refrigerant in that refrigerator is leaking. And then the indirect impact that comes from the electricity generation needed to operate that device. And in the pie chart, you see the average worldwide share of direct and indirect refrigerant, but this varies from country to country depending on the energy mix of that country. So for example, in Brazil, the direct impact will be much larger because most of the electricity production is based on hydro, renewable, and so very little CO2 is emitted during the production of electricity. So so mainly the challenges and opportunities in the Kigali Amendment framework. So we are still at an early stage, because since this is new, there hasn't been really quite a demand for new refrigerants and new technologies, and those that exist are very expensive. So this is an opportunity in the sense that this is a new market, and if there is a demand, the prices will also go down. This is kind of also a chicken and egg problem, but it is possible to overcome this. Then afterwards, because we're dealing with the higher flammability of the refrigerants, the safety codes and standards have to be adapted, because as they are right now, some of them are a bit too strict and block the implementation of using more flammable refrigerants, even if the appliance is designed for those refrigerants. And then also there's a lack of skills in the technicians and trainings for technicians that deal with these refrigerants, because these are new types of refrigerants. So maybe under pressure, under high pressure, flammable. And so these all require new skills. And it's not going to do anything, help if we have a very efficient, well-designed and well-sealed appliances, if when that appliance is disassembled, the refrigerant just leaks in the air. And so there's also a big opportunity in the phase down to link it with existing policy measures, so that we do not take this in isolation. And one of the big links is also with the energy efficiency policies, to either set up some new policies in countries where they don't exist yet, so setting up minimum energy performance standards, or also other instruments to promote energy efficiency at the same time while we're phasing down HFCs. So I put here some further resources if you're interested. And yes, this is it from my side.
Thank you very much, Hélène, for that very insightful presentation. We're running a little bit late on time, so without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Dan Hamza-Goodacre, who is well familiar with the Kigali Amendment, as he is the Executive Director of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, which is a program which is all about putting efficiency at the heart of the Kigali Amendment. So, Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jenny, for the introduction and the invitation, and I will try my best to be quick. I can talk fast but clearly, so let's see what we can do. I'm going to give you all an overview of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, or KCEP as we call it. KCEP is a philanthropic collaboration set up following the Kigali Amendment, a website to walk you through what we're up to. So you'll see here on the homepage our overall vision. It's a fairly grandiose one, but ultimately we would like to see a world in which environmentally friendly, energy efficient cooling is accessible to all who need it, and pretty much everyone on the planet needs cooling in some way. Our more specific aim as a program is to enhance the energy efficiency of cooling to increase the climate and development benefits of the Kigali Amendment. So in particular, the phasing out of HFCs and the phasing down of HFCs. And our focus is really on the energy efficiency of the components. As has just been identified, the efficiency gains from the refrigerant are small relative to those from looking at the product itself. So our focus is on the compressors, the heat exchangers, the actual product, or sometimes even the system. And we have gone about trying to achieve this aim in really 4 ways. So we call these windows. This is the page on the website. You can scroll through this at your own leisure. The 4 windows are strengthening for efficiency, policy standards and programs, finance, and then access to cooling. And I'll just give you a summary of each of those in turn. The first, strengthening for efficiency. This is about how to support discussions in the Montreal Protocol about the integration of energy efficiency into the HFC transition. We're doing that in a number of ways. We're supporting the twinning of ozone officers with energy efficiency policymakers. These two policy communities have not always worked very closely together, sometimes have never worked together, and so we're bringing them together through a training program that's being run by UN Environment. Secondly, we are supporting a number of countries to look at how they could integrate energy efficiency into their F-gas management plans, the HPMPs, so they can take this joined up approach. Thirdly, we are co-funding with the MLF, the Multilateral Fund, efforts to identify the costs and benefits of improvements to energy efficiency products and changes to production lines, whilst those companies receive funds from the MLF to comply with their obligations under the Montreal Protocol for F-gases. Fourthly, we are also trying to make the links between the institutions of the Montreal Protocol and the UNFCCC regime, particularly as we go into another round of nationally determined contributions, where we hope we can reflect some of the new cooling policies that will be happening over the next years into the NDC enhancements. And then the fifth area of work under this window is to develop a number of knowledge products and to actually support some training for technicians and engineers on the ground. Second window, policy standards and programs. That's very much about government policies, mostly at the national level. The door is open to subnational activity. We haven't done so much of that, but also corporate action. And the main focus here is on minimum energy performance standards, as has just been mentioned, particularly for air conditioners and fridges. Met minimum energy performance standards have been shown historically to have made a significant contribution to reducing energy consumption and therefore helping tackle climate change. So we're following in those historical footsteps. We're also focused in some countries on supporting better monitoring, reporting and verification, because without the testing of equipment, without the labeling, it's quite hard to know what's going on, whether we're making any progress, is everybody playing fair. Thirdly, we are supporting some demonstrations on the supply side where there are particularly more sort of innovative, efficient, clean technologies or business models that need a little bit of help in order to get some further application in the marketplace. And then fifthly, also engaging with businesses looking at procurement policies and their overall approaches to their consumption of energy for cooling, and working in partnership with organisations like the Consumer Goods Forum. Third part of the programme is about finance. The aim there is simple: it's to try and use our grant finance to mobilise as much capital as possible, noting that the amount of money that we've got, whilst generous, is not enough to significantly impact the $140 billion or so annual size of the cooling industry worldwide. So we are looking to partner with banks and other providers of capital, private equity, other forms of private finance, and currently reviewing those options. There's some interesting proposals on the table, including to set up sort of on-bill financing programs, to use the ESCO model, the energy saving company model, to look at investments in the infrastructure and how we can mainstream efficient clean cooling in those. Cooling as a service, which tries to adopt some of the circular economy approaches, as we've seen with lighting as a service and mobility as a service, but to do that for cooling. And then some examples of rebates, sort of slightly more standard subsidy approach. All of that's coming together. It's looking quite exciting. We look forward to making some announcements towards the end of this year, at the beginning of next year. Fourth part of the program is about access to cooling. We've heard some really important statistics so far about the links to sustainable development. This part of the program, we've been working with SE for All, commissioned the report on chilling prospects, which I hope you've all seen. If not, please look at it. It's wonderful. It's got great methodology and some powerful statistics. As a follow-up to that report, we're looking to identify partnerships with development organizations for whom cooling can help their own goals, for example, in relation to health or social housing, informal housing, or even in relation to sustainable land use and the protection of the oceans. We have also, as part of our work on access to cooling, launched this week a prize through the Ashton Awards focused on cooling for people working outside or people in transit, because they're often overlooked in terms of their cooling needs, and the solutions in the marketplace are not as prevalent, as well as a partnership with the International Energy Agency to try and integrate some of these cooling for all ideas into their energy efficiency training. So that's our program in a nutshell. You will see on the website, we also provide a number of resources. This is part of our role in sort of spreading knowledge. We're not trying to be a library or the knowledge factory. There's lots of you out there doing great work on that already. We don't want to duplicate that, but occasionally issues pop up where we feel there's a gap, and then we produce a little briefing note to cover that, So we've done some on cooling as a service, the role of China in South-South cooperation. We've also looked at optimization of cooling technology, because there's a huge stock of cooling technology in place which isn't working as well as it should, and that comes with a climate impact. Finally, I should say, and hopefully I've saved you 5 minutes, progress. Actually, it's always important to be accountable for what we've done. We're just at the beginning of our second year, so our first year is very much about takeoff, and I feel like we've put in place a lot of the building blocks for the outcomes to happen in the years ahead. In our first year, you'll see from our website, we managed to, let's scroll down, form partnerships with 38 countries, it's a bit more than that now. 27 are writing national cooling plans I referred to earlier. We should be seeing 23 minimum energy performance standards come through over the next couple of years. All 147 developing countries are receiving the twinning training that I mentioned. Lots of consultation going on. We programmed over $30 million worth of grants in our first year. We've found partnerships with 15 businesses, and our alliance included 18 organizations. Last year, we're probably up to more like 25 or 30 now. The other thing I'll just highlight from our annual report is that we are also tracking what we're doing, and we have a partnership with the International Energy Agency. Is that going to work? That is going to work. There you go. You can see that the IEA created the Global Exchange on Efficiency, and in there, what they're doing is tracking the progress of our program in terms of contributions to different policies and market transformation for the products that are actually being sold. But the IEA are doing that in the context of a larger exchange that looks at energy efficiency beyond just cooling. The IEA also produced a report recently on the future of cooling, which if you haven't seen, please have a look. And I'll leave you just with this one statistic, which is that they project that future demand for cooling globally will be greater than total electricity demand for everything in the US, Europe, and Japan, which is a quite staggering statistic. So I will pause there. Hopefully that's useful, and I look forward to taking questions.
Thanks a lot, Dan. That's very impressive work that KSEP is doing, and I think you're right in recalling the energy demand increase that we're likely to see in the future. So we have a bit of time left for questions. Thank you, Dan, for being prompt. I have to say that it's largely thanks to you. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the questions tab. We already have one for Dan, actually. So the question is, does the KSEP have any quantifiable objectives in terms of how much finance it aims to leverage via Windows 3 in a given time frame?
That's literally a $1 million question, and has been a hot topic in our team and with our funders. The answer is yes, we do. The figure that we put out there at the beginning of the program was $250 million of leverage using the 10 million that we've got. And we're talking there about concessional finance being mostly cheaper loans, not leverage of grants. It's a large number to leverage just from a loan perspective. It's a huge number from grant perspective. So that's our target. And from what we are looking at so far with the proposals, it does not look like an unrealistic target. In fact, we are so far, smiling at what's possible, but yet to contract all of this. So we hope to come back to everybody with some really good news about partnership between philanthropy and banks in order to mobilize large amounts of money.
Okay, thanks a lot. We have another question for Hélène. Is there scope to make energy efficiency an integral part of the amendment to the same extent that switching to refrigerants with a lower global warming potential currently is, or is it destined to remain in the realm of an informal opportunity in the margin of the Kigali Amendment? Hélène, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. I mean, I would say from the talks that I've seen is that there is a strong wish of parties to have that as an integral part of the amendment. Then afterwards, it's very difficult because the Montreal Protocol was not made we're slowly going out of the scope of the Montreal Protocol. So I think that's still something being discussed amongst parties, but I do find that there is a strong will to make that happen.
Okay, thank you very much. And we also have a question for Xianli, lots of active participation online. Beyond technical re-engineering of cooling equipment, would you also say that behavioral change in relation to how profusely we use cooling equipment, particularly in developed countries today, is also needed? And if so, is this behavioral aspect recognized or reflected in the Kigali Amendment?
Yes, thank you for the question. Especially, yes, for the developed country, definitely behavioral change is needed. We see overcooling in some parts of the world, that the office, the shopping malls are so cold, people have to wear shoes or jackets. And we also see like people have huge refrigerators, and food are stored there for months or years. People never use it. Before even they expired. And also that's a problem in the developed world, is that food, more like food waste. A lot of the food in the developing country is food loss. But in developed country is a large problem, is the food waste. People actually buy more than needed or cooked more than needed. A larger part of the food was thrown out even before they reach the consumers, supermarkets, throw out meat and other things because they expire. So this is a problem. And to solve this, realize the cooling for all, we need to make the behavioral change also a necessary part of the solution, the policy instrument. I think the Kigali Amendment, maybe Helena knows better, like there's no, prescription of what action to be taken. That's definitely campaigns, raising awareness, but that's part of the solution, but I'm not sure how much or resource or any prescription on this for the role of behavioral change.
Hélène, would you like to complement that answer?
Yeah, I would say that behavior has a lot to do with the impact of our appliances, and if we look at, for example, what is going on in Europe with the legislation for energy efficiency on appliances in general, these do not touch upon behavioral change. They maybe could incite users or have certain energy saving functions, but putting minimum limits of minimum temperatures I find that is I think it's a bit difficult to implement.
Yeah, and to reflect in the Kigali Amendment, my understanding, these behavioral aspects are not included. No. Okay, thank you very much.
Can I make a comment on that?
Yep, sure, Dan.
Yeah, so it's definitely not just a problem in developed countries. I just want to be very clear about that. You know, there are lots of examples of wasteful use of cooling, but it happens in lots of developing countries as well, from Thailand through the Gulf and elsewhere. We actually wrote a report on this, launched at the beginning of this year, called Freezing in the Tropics, which is a somewhat ironic title, but reflects the reality of what is happening far much more than it should. And then the second point is that it's not just about overcooling in terms of behavior change that would be helpful from consumers. It's about how consumers see the cost of cooling, which is still typically about the cost of the initial purchase for the appliance, rather than thinking about the whole life cost of receiving cooling, because ultimately people want the cooling really more than they want the air conditioner. And we're really not there yet in helping people to understand that more efficient appliances is actually cheaper over the lifetime of the product.
That's a great point. Unfortunately, we have to stop the Q&A session here. Thank you all to your questions online. I'm sorry we couldn't take them all. There are the email addresses of the panelists in the save the date and invitation you received, so feel free to contact them. I'd now like to move to the last part of our webinar, which is a panel discussion bringing together Dan, that you've just heard, Tim Gabriel, who, as a reminder, works at the Environmental Investigation Agency as an environmental lawyer. And we also have Paul Kellett, manager of the United for Efficiency program at UN Environment. So welcome to you both. My first question is addressed to Tim and Paul. So currently we have 43 countries that have ratified the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. This is more than is needed for the amendment to enter into force in January, but this number remains considerably low, particularly in light of the fact that the Montreal Protocol was universally ratified. Do either of you consider this slow ratification as worrisome? And if so, what do you consider to be the top 2 challenges associated to countries' ratification, and how can these be overcome? Tim, would you like to go first?
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity to participate. Is the current pace of ratification worrisome? I would say yes and no. I mean, on the one hand, it is to be expected, because it does take time for many countries to go through the national process of ratification. A lot of times it's legislation that requires markup and debate, and we've often heard that that can take up to 18 to 24 months. And given that Kigali was adopted on the 15th of October in 2016, that puts us close to this time frame. So I think it's a question of timing, and we need to give a little bit of time to the parties. But then on the other hand, we are eager to see a groundswell of ratification. And so that's why it is a bit worrisome that we don't see it, but then we have to be patient. On the developed country side, I think we have seen some important ratifications from countries such as Australia, Canada, and Norway, as well as about 13 by my count of the 28 European Union member states. And the remaining 15 are not a concern, it's just a question of timing. But I think we'd like to see some urgency from Japan, and in particular the US, where the political situation around ratification is a little bit delicate. And then on the developing country side, we have several countries, many small. The big ones certainly are missing, such as China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. But again, for many, it's a question of going through the national process, as well as resources for developing countries. We have to remember that resources have only recently been made available in the context of Fast Start funding and enabling activities for some of these countries to go through the process of ratification at the national level to be able to submit their instrument to the Montreal Protocol. So we do have that. And then lastly, I'll just note, though, that the Multilateral Fund has been making funding contingent on letters of intent to ratify being submitted. So some of the early funding is contingent on that. And more recently, further funding for certain projects has been made contingent on ratification. So we do see some push on the Multilateral Fund side of things.
Okay, thanks. That's definitely some incentives for ratification. Paul, would you like to complement this answer?
Yeah, and thank you very much, Jenny, on behalf of United for Efficiency. Very interesting, and thank you for the question in terms of Kigali Amendment. Just to say, our focus is on Sustainable Development Goal 7, doubling the rate of improvement of energy efficiency. And in terms of the ratification, I think yeah, it's two sides, if you like. Very good to see the important progress, and through a well-designed mechanism, I think, in terms of refrigerant phase down. Very good to see the number of countries already committed, and to see the design of the amendment, which will drive forward, I think, very progressively. There are well-designed measures. And I think the objectives will be met in terms of refrigerant. the concern on our side would be around the energy efficiency aspect. In terms of energy efficiency, there's many complex challenges, large opportunities. I think just to say that the scale of the emissions from the electricity consumption of the likes of air conditioners and refrigerators is about 80% of the total greenhouse gas emissions from the equipment. So it's very, very significant, and the opportunity to combine the Kigali Amendment and energy efficiency in terms of climate-friendly and energy-efficient equipment is very important. And the scale of the challenge is something I think that, in terms of mentioning two main challenges, I think much more information on the scale of the issue is needed. The emissions from the sector, 2014 were around 4 million tons a year, and this will double by 2030. So it's a real issue. Developing countries, the main driver, as has been mentioned by the speakers, very fast growth rates in developing countries. From our assessment of 150 countries, we noted that some 1 billion air conditioners will be added to the global stock by 2030. Similarly with refrigerators, almost 1 billion new refrigerators added to the global stock by 2030. So it's going to pose a real issue in terms of peak demand. I think that's a very serious issue, which is affecting some of the emerging economies right now. And I think secondly, in terms of incentivizing efficient cooling appliances, far more needs to be done to incentivize strategic programs. The potential for equipment improvement is very, very large. I mean, just looking at the International Energy Agency, who are one of our partners under United for Efficiency, their report on cooling recently just highlighted that the average coefficient of performance is around 3 across the globe, if you like. And then what's available in countries, coefficient of performance of air conditioners I'm speaking about is 6. So it's possible to improve or to significantly improve the performance of air conditioners, for example. And just from our recent policy guide that we released late last year on climate-friendly and energy-efficient air conditioners, I can see that equates to a saving of about 100 coal-fired power station, the electricity production from 100 coal-fired power stations. So I think they're the two main challenges: information awareness on the scale of the issue, and the incentives for much more efficient cooling appliances, particularly air conditioners.
Great, thanks a lot. My second question is addressed to Paul and Dan. So like KSEP and United for Efficiency, many stakeholders are mobilized around preparing the implementation of the Kigali Amendment. But what gaps do you see in this framework of initiatives, particularly in relation to making sure that energy efficiency opportunities in the context of the Kigali Amendment are fully reaped? Dan, what are your views on this?
So I think there's lots that we are doing which could be impactful, is already starting to be impactful, and we'll find out more over the next few years that should be attractive to parties to the Montreal Protocol and could therefore be integrated into the regime. So I'll just say that very sort of high level in terms of everything that I just walked everybody through for our program. But to pick something more specific, I think that there's still a serious gap with regards to policy coordination. And I say that as a previous civil servant for the UK government. I see a need for better regulation to join up what's happening on the HFC side and on the energy efficiency side. Right now, we've got a number of climate finance sort of institutions and mechanisms, including the likes of the GCF and the JEF, the World Bank. There's bilateral aid. There's a spaghetti soup, quite frankly, of organizations that are providing climate finance. And then we've got the MLF as the implementing entity of the Montreal Protocol, providing finance for the F-gas transition, which is now actually really also climate finance, because that's where the impact is environmentally. And I don't see a lot of these sort of institutions and flows of finance talking to each other. I think that's one thing to flag. I also don't see good coordination at the national level in terms of policy making. So it's still more common than it is rare that a policy will be developed for minimum energy performance standards separate from the policies that are being transposed from the Montreal Protocol at the national level, and labeling, you know, is another manifestation of that, where a label will highlight what the energy performance of that technology is, but it won't say anything about the global warming potential. I think there are other varieties of policy mechanisms that are just not joined up at the national level, or even the sub-national. And then at the international level, of course, we've got the Montreal Protocol timeline as agreed in Kigali, and then there's the UNFCCC sort of rolling 5-year timeline of updates to NDCs, and I don't really see them talking to each other either. And you know, I think there could be better policy making done in that regard. There's also, down at the level of practical action, a need for better coordination, in that, you know, engineers are trained to go out and fix leaks in F-gases, but not necessarily looking beyond that to reconfigure anything on the energy efficiency side, even as simply as cleaning coils at the back of fridges and ventilation, which, you know, look at our optimization briefing, we calculated 30 gigatons of savings from better cleaning of existing stock. So I think we're missing a trick there. You know, the community's developed things like refrigeration driving licenses. You know, don't actually include certification or energy efficiency. So yeah, big gap in sort of policy coordination and implementation coordination.
Thanks a lot, Dan. I think those are very important points. Policy coordination when it comes to environmental issues is always a big question, and also a good point on sort of coordination of the implementation. Paul, do you have any further views on this?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to listen to Dan in terms of the strategic approach that should be taken, and I certainly think the opportunity with the Kigali Amendment is there for a strategic approach to both the climate-friendly refrigerants and energy efficiency. Definitely think that there's a lack of a strategic approach, lack of market transformation programs. From our experience in successful market transformation programs across some 40 countries, in particular on lighting, we can see that these programs typically take 3 to 5 years. They cost about 1 million per product per year, and they yield 100 times that in saving. And I think if the same approach was applied to cooling appliances, strategic commitment to 3 to 5 year programs, that would be a sustainable way of ensuring climate-friendly and energy-efficient appliances in the various markets. I mean, we've seen a big gap in many developing countries in terms of minimum energy performance standards, where, you know, just doesn't exist, or they don't exist effectively, and that of course allows the low quality, low cost equipment to dominate the market, and that needs to be corrected. But that can only be corrected by strategic market transformation program approach. I mean, on the lighting side, we can see that works. We have a 5-step approach across the 40-odd countries that we're supporting. We talk about best minimum energy performance standards. 2015, which I just looked there, for air conditioners, that would actually mean a 30% improvement over and above what's currently in the developing country markets typically at the moment. The second step is labeling and information awareness communications. The third one is critical, is monitoring, verification and enforcement. There's no point in having best minimum energy performance standards if you don't monitor and verify and enforce that. And critical one then, financing, incentives to drive the better products in the market faster and to accelerate the change. And lastly then, of course, the environmentally sound management to properly dispose of the obsolete or replaced equipment. And you know, that's on a typical lighting 5-step approach, which we would see as very necessary on the cooling appliance side. And the resourcing of these 3 to 5 year market transformation programs it seems particularly difficult to get the funding to deliver that at scale, and we're trying to change that, of course. But anything that can be done, and in terms of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, it's very heartening to see the level of support being provided to prime market transformation programs from our perspective.
Thanks a lot, Paul. And I have to say, I think it's an important point to highlight the importance of minimum energy performance standards and also the challenges associated to developing those. So great points made there. So we've just got a few minutes left in this webinar. So this will most likely be the last question addressed to Tim and Dan. To finish on a positive note, and this may be of interest to our listeners, as many may have privileged ties with governments and companies, could you share with us success stories of stakeholders, so for example, companies or governments, grasping the energy efficiency opportunity in relation to the phase down of HFCs? Tim, would you like to answer that one first?
Sure, absolutely. It's a bit of a difficult question, to be honest, because in my view, it's a bit too early to tell how companies might be taking advantage of energy efficiency opportunities in the context of the HFC phase down. Under the Kigali Amendment, the HFC phase down for developed countries is set to begin in 2019. And for developing countries, it only begins in 2024 for the group, the first group of what we call Group 1. So at the moment, the HFC phase down is technically not in effect, although we have agreed to it. But there is an exception to this, where we have an HFC phase down that is compelling a market transition, and that's in the European Union. The European Union in 2014 adopted the EU F-gas regulation, which froze HFC consumption in 2015, had a phase down step in 2016, and then in real terms has essentially reduced its HFC consumption by 48% starting this year, so January 2018. So they basically have halved the HFC consumption. And what we're seeing in the European Union is a massive, and I do not use that lightly, a massive movement in the cold food chain to transition to natural refrigerants, which in turn is also leading to more energy efficient technologies. And they're taking advantage of this to have technological upgrades and to do better designs on their systems. We're also seeing, with respect to the existing equipment, improved servicing practices so that the equipment leaks less. Because if the equipment leaks less, they need to buy less refrigerant. And since there's less refrigerant on the market, that's more expensive to acquire. And so in that way, we're also seeing improvement on existing systems from better servicing practices. There are many retailers leading the way. For example, in many supermarkets, we're seeing a lot of transcritical CO2. In 2015, we had 5,500 systems. By early 2018, that had jumped to over 14,000. There are about 110,000 refrigeration units in total in the EU. And so when I say major retailers, though, I'm referring to companies such as Carrefour, Tesco, Metro, Aldi, Waitrose, Marks and Spencer. And so I think our challenge at the global level will be, once the HFC phase down does begin and starts to kick into effect, would be mainstreaming this transition that we're seeing in the European Union at the global level. So that's the first challenge that we have. And then the second would be, I would say, figuring out how to solve this air conditioning conundrum. Because we would like to see more efficient AC units be placed on the market, but there are a lot of challenges to that we're grappling with at this moment.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tim. Dan, I think in the last few minutes that we have left, you'll be making the closing points for this panel discussion. Do you want to react to that in terms of success stories from stakeholders?
Sure, thanks, Jenny. And Tim's right. It's early days, but there are also early movers, and we're pleased to be working with the Multilateral Fund in support of a number of businesses that are looking at energy efficiency and how they need to make changes for compliance with the Montreal Protocol and leapfrog. So examples being Walton in Bangladesh and Mame in Mexico, Argentinian manufacturers as well, and work's being done in partnership with UNIDO and UNDP. So and you can go and look at the documents on the OZ Secretariat's website to see the decisions that are made about those projects. So, other examples I'd give, really then sort of jumping ahead to future ways of cooling, startups like Ecozen in India with their EcoFrost cold room, using solar power to create sort of portable storage facilities for farmers for their fruit and vegetables. Sort of 5 tons of space. These things can go like 30 hours without power, and they're often being leased to the farmers so they can rotate them round depending on crop cycles. So there's some good technology. There's some interesting business models we're seeing. I'd also take my hat off to India for early efforts to highlight what could be done in energy efficiency in the context of its HPMP and in its FS management plans, and really seeking to work on energy efficiency as soon as possible. They've taken a leadership position in the context of the Montreal Protocol and efforts that are being made. And then I guess the other example that comes to mind is California. Very recently, having spent years living there, I'm still following the news. Kudos to the government there for passing the Cooling Act about a week ago. They have agreed to reduce HFC use by, I think, 40% by 2030. And of course, California has its own policies, minimum energy performance standards on air conditioning, as well as something called Title 24, which is about HVAC installation. Although I should say, I don't see coordination on those as good as it could be, but nonetheless, they put those two things on the table. So I think we have got some examples of businesses that are grasping this opportunity at the level of sort of developing countries and farmers, up to the level of major manufacturers of air conditioners and fridges, and then countries like India and subnational governments like California, racing ahead. So we very much hope we'll see a lot more of that in the years to come, and certainly the efforts that we put in place can contribute to what I think is going to be an absolute transformation in the way that the world receives the cooling that is increasingly needed.
Thanks a lot, Dan. I think that's a great positive note to finish on, and as the French say, this will have to be the word of the end for this panel discussion. I'd like to thank you all very much for sharing your insights on this issue, and we've reached the end of this webinar, and so I'd like to once again warmly thank all of our speakers, Xianli, Hélène, Dan, Tim, and Paul, for your interventions today. It was very insightful. And I think they've provided some very valuable insights into the Kigali process and on how countries can reap the energy efficiency opportunities linked to it. Highlighting, of course, once again, that taking action on energy efficiency is crucial in the context of climate action. So in addition to the speakers, I'd of course like to warmly thank all those that joined online and engaged with us today. Thank you very much. I hope that you found this event interesting. The recording, as I mentioned, will be available on the Copenhagen Center for Energy Efficiency website in the next few days, and I assume we'll be able to circulate a link to that recording, and feel free to share this link with your networks. So thank you very much for your attention, and it is 16 minutes past the hour, so we're on time, and I wish you all a very good day. Thank you very much.